Beneath 100 acres of Vatican marble lies a vault of silence, sealed doors, forbidden scrolls, and secrets that could upend everything we think we know about history, faith, and reality itself. From vanished popes to demonic letters, from alien relics to time-warping machines, these aren't just forgotten stories. They're locked truths, hidden in plain sight. This isn't a conspiracy. It's a confession no one dares to make. Tonight, we open the vault. These are the 49 most unsolved ancient Vatican mysteries that cannot and will not be explained. Welcome to the darkness behind the holy light. Before we dive any deeper, hit that subscribe button because, trust me, what's coming next might not stay online forever. Also, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in Detroit? Because let's be honest, this is exactly the kind of video you stumble into when you're up way too late, and the Vatican's silence feels just a little too loud. The true contents of the Vatican secret archives. Let's be clear about one thing right away. When an institution decides to rebrand something called the secret archives, the last thing they're trying to do is make it less mysterious. In 2019, the Vatican made a polite little PR move and renamed their infamous vault of cryptic materials the Vatican Apostolic Archive, which sounds slightly more holy and slightly less like the place where Indiana Jones' worst nightmares go to rot. But make no mistake, it's still locked tighter than a tomb and about as welcoming. The archives are over 50 miles long. Yes, you read that right. Miles and house documents dating back over 1,200 years. But don't bother packing your Rosetta Stone or your Dan Brown decoder ring. You're not getting in. Only a microscopic handful of accredited scholars are allowed to apply for access, and even then, they're only allowed to request specific documents. You can't browse. You can't wander. You can't even sneeze on the wrong parchment without a cardinal personally teleporting in to vaporize you with a holy glare. Now here's where things get deliciously weird. Former insiders and Vatican whistleblowers have long whispered that behind all the dry theological paperwork and papal grocery lists lies something different. Maybe it's the original Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Maybe it's proof that Jesus didn't just rise from the dead, he also filed a tax return. Or maybe it's a treasure trove of politically inconvenient truths, centuries of heresies, hidden miracles, suppressed scientific discoveries, and letters that begin with, "Dear Satan." And while some church officials insist there's nothing to see here, that's exactly the sort of thing you say when you're guarding a cosmic time bomb. One particularly persistent rumor suggests that certain files detail direct encounters with non-human intelligences. Another claims that the Church has documents that rewrite early Christian history so profoundly the whole scaffolding of Western theology would snap like a communion wafer. What we do know is that the archive contains things like Galileo's trial records, letters from Michelangelo, and documents relating to the excommunication of Martin Luther. But that's just what they let us see. What else might be hidden in those climate-controlled catacombs? Perhaps prophecies too bleak to reveal, or ancient truths that make the Church's entire narrative wobble like an overfilled chalice. Of course, you might be wondering, why would the Vatican keep such documents secret? Well, maybe because the next mystery waiting in the dark corners of those same archives is even more dangerous. Especially when it threatens to rewrite the Bible itself. The missing books of the Bible. You know those Gospels that didn't make the cut? The ones they quietly left on the editing room floor of divine history? Yeah, turns out the Bible might have had deleted scenes. The standard version, the one you probably cracked open once in a hotel room just to say you did, contains 66 books. Neat, symmetrical, holy. But early Christian history was a lot messier than the leather-bound King James would like you to believe. There were dozens of other Gospels. Some were considered too radical, others too feminine, and some just a little too uncomfortably honest. Enter the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, all real, all excluded, Why? Because the early church didn't just inherit the divine word, they curated it like a nervous PR team trying to launch the brand new kingdom of heaven. And the Vatican? Well, they're the longtime owners of the original manuscript club. Many believe the Vatican possesses original, possibly first-century copies of these banned books kept neatly out of public reach in acid-free folders inside their impossibly guarded archive. Take the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for instance, a document that portrays Mary not as a weepy groupie washing feet with her hair, but as a spiritual equal to Jesus, possibly even his chosen successor. Not the kind of thing you want lying around when you're building a male-only clergy. And then there's the Gospel of Judas. Forget betrayer. This version has Judas as Jesus' most trusted disciple, the only one wise enough to help him fulfill his cosmic exit strategy. Which, in biblical PR terms, is like finding out Brutus was actually Caesar's therapist. These texts weren't just ignored, they were erased, labeled heretical, and buried sometimes literally. The Vatican has always maintained that these apocryphal texts are dangerous because they spread confusion, which is code for they make our version look optional. Scholars have tried for decades to pressure the Church into releasing everything it knows. But the Vatican remains coolly quiet, occasionally tossing out a fragment here and there, like a parent giving their toddler the crusts and saving the good part for later. So what else is missing? What lines were cut from the script of divine salvation? And more importantly, what if the most explosive truths aren't ancient myths at all, but things the Vatican's been actively watching unfold in real time? Like, say, a machine that lets you literally rewind history. The chronovisor device. Okay, this one is either Vatican techno-magic or the world's most ambitious episode of Mythbusters. Imagine a device allegedly built by a Benedictine monk, an Italian scientist, and possibly a few bored angels that allows you to view any moment from the past. No, not as a metaphor. Literally. Like Netflix. But for history. That's the chronovisor. Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a real-life priest and physicist, because that's not a red flag already, claimed in the 1952nd that he helped invent a machine that could tune into the electromagnetic remnants of historical events, sort of like eavesdropping on time itself. He said he watched Christ's crucifixion. He saw Napoleon give speeches. He even attended a lost play by Quintus Ennius. And unlike most people who lie for attention, he did not try to start a cult or sell merch. He just kind of said it happened and disappeared behind a wall of ecclesiastical silence. The Vatican's response? A masterclass in suspicion. In 1988, the Church issued a formal warning that anyone possessing or using a device like the chronovisor could face excommunication, which is odd. Because usually when people lie about seeing Jesus on toast, the Church doesn't exactly whip out the canon law. Some believe the Vatican seized the original chronovisor and dismantled it, or kept it running quietly beneath Rome. Others say Ernetti made the whole thing up. A blurry photo surfaced allegedly from the chronovisor of Jesus on the cross. It looked suspiciously like an old church statue. Still, no one can fully debunk the claim, mostly because the Vatican never actually denied it existed. They just looked uncomfortable. Why does that matter? Because if the Vatican does have a machine that can see into the past, it means they've watched things the rest of us only read about. Biblical events, unfiltered miracles, and possibly deeply inconvenient truths. Imagine if they know for sure what happened during Jesus' resurrection and it wasn't what we think. Or worse, imagine if they've used the machine to look ahead. Because there's another piece of Vatican tech floating in the Arizona desert, and this one has a name, so on the nose it sounds like the setup to a punchline. Lucifer Telescope Connection. The Vatican owns a telescope. That part is not a conspiracy. It's real, it exists, and it's sitting pretty on Mount Graham in Arizona, right next to telescopes operated by NASA and the University of Arizona. But then there's the name. Officially, it's the Large Binocular Telescope Near-Infrared Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research, which is such a tortured acronym that someone, somewhere, must have looked at it and thought, hey, if we twist it just right, it kinda spells Lucifer. And that's exactly what they did. Now, to be fair, the Vatican swears up and down that they didn't name it Lucifer. It was supposedly the German scientists working on the camera module, right? Because nothing puts the public at ease quite like German scientists naming astronomical instruments after the Prince of Darkness. Combine that with the fact that this telescope specializes in observing deep space infrared signatures, heat signals from stars, galaxies, and other uncomfortably distant unknowns, and you've got yourself a recipe for conspiracy stew. Cue the avalanche of wild speculation. Why is the Vatican, an institution famously skeptical of anything that doesn't involve candles and incense, peering into the cold void of deep space? What exactly are they looking for with their demon-named space eyeball? Some believe the Church is secretly monitoring celestial anomalies, things that don't follow known physical laws, rogue planets, interstellar objects that speed up for no reason, or worse, visitors. Not angels descending on clouds, but something a bit more biological, mechanical, curious. Others think they're not looking for aliens at all. They're looking for something else. Something ancient, like a returning star, or a cosmic gate, or a heavenly body that matches some long-forgotten prophecy from a scroll they'll never admit to having. Let's not forget, the Vatican Observatory is one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world. They've been watching the skies since the 1502nd, and this particular site in Arizona, it's sacred land for the Apache. The mountain is said to be a portal between worlds. So, of course, the Church set up shop right on top of it, strapped a heat-sensitive camera to the stars, and pretended everything was perfectly normal. But the question remains, what happens when you spend decades watching the heavens and something starts watching back? It's one thing to read signs in the sky, it's another when things start manifesting on Earth. Like, say, people levitating during an exorcism. The Exorcism Files. If you thought the Vatican's interest in deep space was unsettling, wait until you hear about their collection of horror stories. Real horror. Spinning heads, ancient languages spoken by children, and mysterious bite marks appearing mid-prayer. And no, this isn't fan fiction, it's the alleged content of the Vatican's Exorcism Files. Yes, the Church still performs exorcisms, hundreds per year. In fact, the demand has increased so much in recent decades that the Vatican literally started hosting training conferences for exorcists. Nothing quite like a PowerPoint slide that says, Stage 3, Diabolical Infestation, to liven up your theology degree. But here's the dark little twist. There are whispers that the Vatican keeps a detailed, classified archive of its most disturbing cases, ones too terrifying, too disruptive, or too contradictory to make public. These files allegedly contain testimonies from priests who watched the possessed speak Latin, Aramaic, or even long-dead dialects they had no way of knowing. Some describe physical phenomena. People suspended mid-air, unholy strength, animals reacting violently, even sudden weather changes. In one particularly famous case, a young woman in South America reportedly burst into flames mid-exorcism. The Vatican never acknowledged it, but certain insiders claim the event was documented and buried in a vault labeled Anomalous Case, Incomplete Resolution. There's a reason the Rite of Exorcism manual contains phrases like, resist the urge to converse with the demon. These aren't just superstitious rituals, they're protocols, procedures. Rules for spiritual warfare, honed over centuries and hidden behind the thick velvet curtains of church discretion. Some theologians argue that demonic possession is just undiagnosed mental illness, and sure, sometimes it island. But not always. Not when a 9-year-old starts reciting first-century Hebrew. Not when crucifixes melt. Not when priests flee. Which brings us back to the archive. Why lock this stuff away? Maybe because if the public ever saw the raw footage, belief in God would skyrocket right alongside belief in Satan and the Vatican? Well, they prefer controlled faith, faith with bumpers. But what if these files aren't just evidence? What if they're warnings? Because buried among the most disturbing cases of possession are strange patterns, timelines, names that repeat, events that sync with prophecies, including one that may have already predicted the end. The Prophecy of the Popes. Written by a 12th century Irish bishop who probably had a little too much Holy Spirit in his mead, the Prophecy of the Popes reads like the Church's version of a season finale script for the apocalypse. Street Malachi, the man behind the prophecy, claimed to have received a vision while on a pilgrimage to Rome. In it, he foresaw every pope that would ever sit on the throne of Street, Peter complete with cryptic nicknames like From the Labor of the Sun and Glory of the Olive. If you're imagining a Dan Brown-style list of medieval prophecies scrawled on sheepskin parchment, congrats, you're absolutely right. What makes this prophecy so unsettling isn't just the eerily accurate match between many of the descriptions and the popes who followed. It's the fact that we're now on the final pope in the list, number 112, Peter the Roman, who, according to Malachi, will witness the destruction of Rome and the final judgment of mankind. Naturally, the Vatican insists the prophecy is a forgery, a medieval hoax, just another apocalyptic shopping list from the days when people thought the Black Plague was a dress rehearsal for the end times. But here's the thing, no one publicly denied the prophecy until it started getting too close. Some popes have even reportedly referenced it in private, jokingly or not so jokingly, calling themselves the last. Others flat out refused to comment. And then there's the Benedict Francis switcheroo. Benedict resigned, an almost unheard of move, and Francis stepped in a pope who, notably, chose not to name himself Peter, but has a background that ties him closely to Rome. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the prophecy isn't meant to be literal. Maybe it's symbolic, a marker that the world of old faiths and medieval power structures is cracking. And when the final pope falls, it's not fire and brimstone we're getting, it's disclosure. A truth so ancient, so destabilizing, that it's been hidden behind 50 miles of Vatican stone and silence. And wouldn't you know it? Someone may have died trying to bring that truth to light. Pope John Paul. I's death. Pope John Paul. I was the spiritual equivalent of a soft sunrise. Humble, warm, painfully decent. In 1978, after only 33 days wearing the papal white, he was found dead in his Vatican bedroom. No autopsy, no explanation, no public clarity, just gone. For an institution that obsesses over protocol, the handling of his death was less holy see and more organized shrug. The official cause? A heart attack. Except, the Vatican changed its story multiple times about who found the body, whether he had a glass of water next to him, even what time he died. And the absence of an autopsy because, allegedly, the Pope's personal physician said he looked peaceful is the ecclesiastical equivalent of putting duct tape over a bullet hole and hoping for the best. Rumors began swirling immediately, and not just from your neighborhood tinfoil hat wearer. Whispers inside the Vatican suggested John Paul. I had stumbled upon damning financial irregularities tied to the Vatican Bank. Yes, they have one, and no, it's not the kind of bank that gives out toaster ovens. At the heart of it was a tangled web of international bankers, mafia connections, and a Masonic lodge operating behind Vatican walls. You know, just your average spiritual accounting error. The theory goes like this. John Paul, I was preparing to remove several high-ranking officials linked to money laundering and corruption. The night before his death, He allegedly wrote out a list of those who were about to be fired. The next morning, he was dead. The note? Disappeared. The list? Never mentioned again. Cardinal Villot, who happened to be at the scene, supposedly cleaned up the room before the body was officially reported. Papers were removed. The glass of water vanished. It was the kind of cleanup job that feels less like respect for the dead and more like deleting browser history. Of course, the Vatican dismissed all of this as nonsense. And maybe at Island, maybe his death was just what they said. Sudden, natural, tragic. But it's hard to ignore the patterns. Power meets purity. Purity threatens power. Power wins. And if someone was willing to kill a pope over a banking scandal, what lengths would they go to protect something even darker? Like, say, their own role in helping the worst villains of the 20th century vanish into thin air. Vatican and the Nazi ratlines. Picture this. It's 1945, World War II is over, and the world is reeling. The Third Reich has crumbled, the Nuremberg trials are getting warmed up, and everyone is on a frantic manhunt for high-ranking Nazis. But while Allied forces are scouring Europe with bayonets and bad intel, a strange thing begins to happen. Nazis start disappearing, vanishing like cigarette smoke into the Vatican mist. This wasn't magic. This was logistics. And the name for this logistical miracle was the ratline. The ratline was a network of escape routes, primarily through Italy, allegedly used by Nazi war criminals to flee to South America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. And who better to help grease those wheels than the Vatican, a powerful, politically insulated institution with vast international reach, diplomatic immunity, and a vested interest in fighting the godless communists? Some of these claims come from declassified intelligence documents, others from memoirs, court testimonies, and the sort of circumstantial evidence that smells like burning documents and holy water. The theory goes that certain Vatican officials, especially within the Jesuit and Franciscan orders, helped forge papers, provide sanctuary, and shuffle these men through cloisters and cathedrals like an unholy underground railroad. And before you ask, yes, many of these Nazis were not just ideologues, they were butchers. Men responsible for genocide, torture, and chemical warfare. Why would the church help them? Two reasons come up again and again. Fear of communism, and a deeply misguided belief that even monsters can be spiritually rehabilitated. Also, let's not forget the less holy reason some of them brought money. Gold, secrets, and connections. The Vatican has always claimed ignorance, innocent intentions, humanitarian compassion. They helped refugees, not criminals, they say. Mistaken identities, wartime chaos. It's all just a big, unfortunate coincidence. But the paper trails suggest otherwise. Stamped travel documents, eyewitnesses, priests later convicted of aiding war criminals. The Vatican Bank's cozy financial ties to fascist regimes don't help the case either. And yet, nothing sticks. No pope has ever been held accountable. The trail always ends in silence. Clean robes, closed doors, unanswered prayers. So what's buried under all that moral ambiguity? Maybe the truth is simple. When power is threatened, it doesn't choose sides. It erases them. Which brings us to a book so massive, so haunted, so heretical. The Vatican allegedly made sure it disappeared from their shelves forever. The Devil's Bible Connection. Ah, the Codex Gigas. A book so heavy it requires two people to lift it, so cursed that legend claims it was written in a single night with the help of the devil himself. Naturally, it's often referred to as the Devil's Bible. And once upon a time, some believe, it was housed within the Vatican itself. Briefly, quietly, until it wasn't. Let's rewind. The Codex Gigas is real. It exists. It's a massive 13th century manuscript from Bohemia, filled with Latin texts, incantations, medical advice, and one very unsettling full-page illustration of Lucifer. Picture a horned demon with a bloated tongue and wild eyes sitting on a throne smiling. No one smiles in medieval manuscripts. It's deeply unnatural. According to legend, the manuscript was created by a monk who broke his monastic vows and was sentenced to death by immurement being sealed alive in a wall. In desperation, he promised to create the world's greatest book in one night. Realizing the task was impossible, he prayed not to God, but to Satan, and the next morning, there it was completed. Bound, and glowing with just a little too much enthusiasm. The manuscript eventually made its way through Europe, stolen, gifted, traded. For centuries it was said to bring disaster wherever it went. Fire, plague, war. Like a cursed USB drive loaded with hell's patch notes. Some rumors suggest the Vatican acquired it at one point, possibly during its sacking or via obscure donation before quietly hiding it away or disposing of it entirely. If they did have it, they never admitted it. But why would they? It's not the sort of thing you showcase during Sunday Mass. Even for the Vatican, it's a little on the nose. What's fascinating is the book's actual content. It includes the entire Vulgate Bible, texts on exorcism, magic, astronomy, and even instructions for summoning spirits. It's a bizarre cocktail of science, scripture, and sorcery, something that shouldn't exist, and yet does. It defies easy classification, like a theological black swan. So where is it now? Some say Sweden, others claim that's a decoy, and some still believe the Vatican has it sealed away in a lead-lined crypt, just in case it starts whispering again. Because if you think that's the strangest artifact the Vatican might be hoarding, you clearly haven't looked beneath the soil. Ancient alien artifacts. So, let's talk about the real elephant in the papal apartment: aliens. Or more specifically, the ancient artifacts that some claim are buried deep within the Vatican's underground labyrinth, objects that suggest humanity wasn't quite as lonely or as local as we've been led to believe. The theory goes like this. Somewhere beneath Vatican City, behind all those stone lions, frescoed ceilings, and diplomatic immunity, are secret vaults containing archaeological evidence of contact with non-human intelligence, alien relics, fossils that don't belong in Earth's evolutionary family tree, metallic tablets that predate known civilizations, even hieroglyphs that match no human language but happen to appear, eerily, in multiple ancient cultures oceans apart. Wild? Sure. But it gets stranger. Allegedly, these items weren't just found, they were retrieved during church-sponsored expeditions. That's right. The Vatican might have been doing Indiana Jones long before Spielberg thought to slap a fedora on a professor. Only in this version, instead of storing relics in museums, they're locking them in climate-controlled crypts under a city-state ruled by celibate diplomats in designer robes. Why would the church care about alien artifacts? Simple. If humanity wasn't created in isolation, if we're not the center of the divine narrative, then the theological scaffolding of Catholic doctrine takes a serious hit. The idea that God made man in his image doesn't mesh well with the discovery of 10-foot-tall lizard skeletons holding laser-etched metal discs from 30,000 years ago. Some fringe theorists claim Vatican scientists have even reverse-engineered fragments of non-human tech things that manipulate gravity, or even affect time perception. A few whispers go further. That deep within the papal archives are records of direct communication with entities not of this world, catalogued with the same precision normally reserved for saintly miracles and Latin translations. Of course, officially, the Vatican denies everything. They're just a humble spiritual institution with a modest telescope named Lucifer and a side interest in time-traveling photo machines. Nothing to see here. But if these relics do exist and are as ancient as claimed, it would mean that human history is incomplete by design, not through ignorance, but omission. A deliberate theological redaction. Which brings us, naturally, to the underground kingdom beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a place that may not hold alien tech, but certainly holds secrets that predate the church itself. Vatican catacombs. Beneath the most famous church in the world lies something most visitors never see. Something older than the Vatican, older than Christianity. A maze of tunnels, crypts, and sealed chambers that extend under Rome like the nervous system of a buried god. The Vatican catacombs are, officially, burial sites. That's what they tell the tourists. Rows of early Christian graves carved into soft Roman rock, humble spaces filled with the bones of martyrs and the forgotten faithful. But the further down you go, the less clear the story becomes. According to some insiders, the catacombs stretch for miles much farther than maps reveal. Some corridors have been permanently sealed, others simply lost to time. And then there are the locked doors. Massive bronze and stone portals with no identifying marks, guarded not by men but by access protocols, known only to a handful of officials. What's behind them, the Vatican won't say. Probably more bones. Or, if you ask the right conspiracy theorists, relics of civilizations erased from history. The architecture tells its own story. Pagan motifs carved into Christian tombs, inverted crosses that predate Christianity. Entire chambers with acoustics so precise they can amplify whispers into thunder. Some rooms remain curiously warm, despite being dozens of meters underground. Others are silent, to the point of physical discomfort, as if the air itself were listening. There's also talk of tunnels that connect directly to the Apostolic Palace, bypassing the surface entirely. Routes once used during sieges, now possibly used for something quieter, more confidential. And then there are the bodies. Not just saints, not just bishops, but others. Figures wrapped in ornate robes, buried with objects no one will explain. Non-Christian artifacts. Items that look suspiciously Egyptian, Babylonian, even pre-Roman. Why keep all this hidden? Maybe because the past, in its rawest form, contradicts the curated narrative of the church. And once you admit the inconsistencies down there, it's only a matter of time before people start asking about the other secrets. Like, say, why a 1917 prophecy caused a century-long headache for the Vatican press office. The third secret of Fatima. Ah, yes, the Fatima prophecy. Proof that when heaven speaks, the Vatican's default reaction is redact and stall. In 1917, 3 Portuguese shepherd children claimed to witness a series of Marian apparitions. These weren't your run-of-the-mill holy sightings. We're talking cosmic-level visions, searing lights, spinning suns, and a radiant woman who allegedly delivered 3 divine messages. The first 2, eventually revealed, warnings about world wars and the rise of Soviet atheism. Scary, sure, but manageable. The third secret, however, became one of the most tightly guarded religious mysteries of the 20th century. For decades, the Vatican refused to release its contents. Rumors flourished. Some said it predicted the assassination of a pope. Others claimed it described nuclear annihilation. And a few, those with the really spicy takes, believed it revealed the church's own collapse, corrupted from within by a shadow order masquerading in holy robes. Finally, in the year 2000, the Vatican caved and published the so-called full text, a dramatic vision of a bishop in white climbing a ruined city, passing corpses and rubble, before being shot and killed. The interpretation? A symbolic reference to the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. Convenient, neat, sanitized. But critics, including high-ranking clergy, were not convinced. They argued the real third secret hadn't been released. That what the Vatican published was the vision portion, but not the accompanying words of the Virgin, which were far more specific and far more apocalyptic. And here's where it gets really thorny. Some believe those words involved a prophecy about a false pope, a schism within the church, a moral implosion that would leave the faithful spiritually orphaned. Possibly even the Antichrist. Already in the Vatican. The Vatican has denied, dodged, and politely refused to engage on these claims, which, naturally, makes the claims even louder. But whether it's half-revealed, misinterpreted, or entirely fabricated, the third secret has done its job. It has sown a seed of doubt so potent, so unkillable, that it now grows in the cracks of every church scandal, every sudden resignation, every fire in a marble hallway. And if you think the prophecy was scary, wait till you hear about a relic they've spent centuries pretending never went missing. The missing spear of destiny. Of all the holy relics said to exist, few carry the mythological baggage of the spear of destiny, the lance that pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion. An object soaked not only in blood but in centuries of apocalyptic lore, imperial obsession, and warlord superstition. Supposedly, whoever possesses the spear holds the fate of the world in their hands. Naturally, this is exactly the kind of object you don't want going missing. And yet, somewhere along the line, it did. Multiple versions of the spear exist, one in Vienna, another in Armenia, a third in Rome, all claiming legitimacy, all under glass, all suspiciously convenient. But the theory whispered by those with a flair for Vatican intrigue is that the real spear is locked deep beneath Vatican soil, hidden after a particularly unflattering chain of events involving Nazis, mysticism, and far too many dramatic hand gestures. Hitler, as the legend goes, believed in the spear's power. He allegedly seized the Austrian version when annexing Vienna in 1938. And in a delicious twist of narrative irony, he reportedly lost it just hours before his death. Whether that's true or just propaganda masquerading as cosmic justice is anyone's guess, but the Vatican's proximity to both versions of the legend is oddly consistent. Some scholars claim the spear was brought to the Vatican centuries ago and stored quietly alongside other relics, like fragments of the True Cross, the Veil of Veronica, and a pair of suspiciously clean nails. But there's one problem. No official Vatican inventory lists the spear. Not even a fake-out placeholder. It's like it never existed. Which, historically speaking, is how the Vatican says, yes, and we're not talking about it. Why hide it? Maybe because the real spear, if ever revealed, could incite a theological arms race. Or maybe, just maybe, it's not in the Vatican anymore. Maybe it was moved, smuggled, used. Some even suggest the spear wasn't a relic of power, but a tool of ancient technology, something not of this world. Which raises the stakes, because if the spear was more than symbolic, and it's now missing, the Vatican may not be guarding humanity's greatest weapon. They may be covering up the fact that it's already been activated. And speaking of bending time and consequence, some believe that same underground vault holds secrets that go even further. Secrets that defy time itself. Vatican and time travel. We've already covered the chronovisor, that allegedly real but definitely not acknowledged time machine created by a Benedictine monk and some suspiciously tech-savvy priests. But the time travel conspiracy doesn't stop there. Oh no, that was just the teaser trailer. The real Vatican time-bending lore is something closer to a metaphysical Cold War. The kind fought not with bombs, but with ancient blueprints and forbidden scrolls. Some fringe researchers believe the Vatican possesses documentation either inherited or discovered, describing methods of time manipulation. These aren't modern theories built on quantum physics. These are ancient sources, Sumerian star maps, Enochian magic systems, and biblical references to time dilation disguised as visions or prophecy, all reportedly cataloged, translated, and quietly tucked away in subterranean archives beneath Rome. According to this narrative, time travel isn't necessarily the sci-fi version we're used to. It's not DeLoreans and flux capacitors. It's spiritual, ritualistic, a consciousness-based journey through what ancient texts refer to as divine windows, or the folds of creation. Naturally, the Vatican denies everything. They barely admit to the chronovisor, and they certainly won't confirm if there's a dimensional elevator shaft underneath the Apostolic Palace. But here's where it gets weirder. Some say time travel isn't something the Church uses, it's something they protect against. That certain relics and rituals are designed to prevent manipulation of sacred history. That key events, biblical, political, cataclysmic, have been tampered with before, and the Church now serves as a cosmic bouncer making sure nobody opens unauthorized timelines. It would explain a lot. The bizarre urgency in suppressing heretical texts, the aggressive curation of Church-approved history, and the Vatican's obsession with prophecy. After all, if you're trying to guard a timeline, it helps to know where it's going. Of course, this all sounds like metaphysical fan fiction. Until you realize the Vatican is the only religious institution on Earth with its own scientific academy, its own astronomical observatory, and diplomatic status recognized by every major country on the planet. Not bad for an outfit that started in sandals and scrolls. But if they have been guarding a secret method of time manipulation, it would make sense to hide it in a book already deemed too dangerous for the public. A book so loaded with celestial drama, fallen angels, and cosmic rebellion that it was banned for centuries. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is the kind of text that makes theologians sweat and conspiracy theorists salivate. A sprawling, apocalyptic fever dream attributed to the great-grandfather of Noah, this ancient manuscript reads like a mashup of Revelation, Dune, and a Marvel origin story for fallen angels. Naturally, the early church locked it out of the official Bible faster than you can say Nephilim. The Book of Enoch tells the tale of a pre-flood earth, when 200 angels called the Watchers descended from heaven, lusted after human women, and produced giants, big ones. The kind that allegedly shook the earth when they walked. These angels taught humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, enchantments, and cosmetics. That's right. According to Enoch, eyeliner was literally invented by fallen angels. Go ahead and update your makeup routine accordingly. The giants, called the Nephilim, became violent and monstrous. God, displeased by this celestial breeding program, unleashed the flood to scrub Earth clean. Enoch, meanwhile, was given divine access to cosmic secrets, how the stars move, how time works, and the inner workings of heaven. He didn't die, either. According to Scripture, Enoch was taken, as in yanked off Earth by divine intervention, possibly to become the Archangel Metatron, which sounds suspiciously like being abducted if you're reading with a modern tinfoil lens. So why would the Vatican ban it? Because Enoch's tale dismantles the neat cosmology of mainstream Christianity. It introduces rogue angels, cosmic warfare, and divine beings who aren't exactly following the party line. And if taken seriously, it makes the Genesis account look like the PG version of a much wilder story. The Book of Enoch was considered canonical by some early Christian groups, especially in Ethiopia, where it remained sacred. But in the West, it vanished. Burned, lost, or hidden depending on whom you ask. Then, centuries later, it re-emerged. And not long after, it was quietly shelved again. Not rejected, not debated. Just ignored. Some say the Vatican has multiple versions of Enoch, more complete, more disturbing. Versions that contain specific names, locations, timelines, perhaps even celestial blueprints. And they don't dare release them, not because people wouldn't believe it, but because they would. Because once you admit fallen angels taught humanity metallurgy, you have to start asking what else they left behind, and what other pagan texts the Church has been hoarding in the dark. Suppressed pagan texts. Somewhere inside the Vatican's underground vaults, just past the section labeled Stuff That Makes Catholics Uncomfortable, there's rumored to be a shelf, or several, packed with books that don't look remotely Christian. Not Gnostic, not heretical, not fringe. We're talking full-blown pagan, Egyptian death rituals, Babylonian cosmology, Druidic invocations to oak spirits and forgotten gods. It's a spiritual mess hall of pre-Christian theology, and if the rumors are true, the Vatican has a front row seat to it all. You might be asking, why would the Vatican, which spent centuries stamping out paganism like it was a heretical game of whack-a-mole, go out of its way to preserve these texts? Because suppressing isn't the same as destroying. You can't fight an enemy you don't understand, and you definitely can't rewrite history unless you first read the original script. These ancient texts were often confiscated during crusades, inquisitions, and conquests dressed in clerical robes. Imagine a bishop staring at a scroll written in Sumerian, deciding it's theologically inconvenient, and promptly filing it under, "Do not open unless the apocalypse starts early." The Church's official stance is that paganism was primitive idolatry. But some of those texts? They describe astrological alignments, resurrection myths, and divine births that eerily echo Christian theology, only they came first. The Egyptian myth of Horus, for example, features a divine child born of a virgin mother. Sound familiar? Babylonian records speak of flood stories and heavenly messengers descending on beams of light. And Celtic Druidic lore includes rituals of death and rebirth tied to solar cycles. If you're constructing a singular, unbroken line of truth from Genesis to Revelation, these parallels become a branding problem. So, allegedly, the Church solved it with a classic move: absorb the parts they liked, incense, holy days, sun symbolism, and bury the rest. Literally. Some insiders claim that deep within the Vatican archives are untranslated or restricted copies of these pagan documents, not because they're dangerous in the magical sense, but because they blur the line between Christian doctrine and the stories that came before it. And if the Vatican really is sitting on proof that Christianity didn't emerge fully formed from divine inspiration, but rather evolved like language, like politics, then those pagan texts aren't just old relics. They're context. And context is a mortal enemy to faith built on exclusivity. Especially when the bones under the basilica might not even belong to who they say they do. The hidden tomb of St. Peter. The Vatican insists that beneath St. Peter's basilica lies the tomb of St. Peter himself, the rock upon which Christ supposedly built his church, and, incidentally, the spiritual foundation of Catholicism. That's a lot of institutional weight for one grave to carry. Which makes the following detail a little awkward. Not everyone is convinced the bones beneath the altar actually belong to Peter. The discovery came in the 1942nd, after a decades-long excavation that carefully peeled back the layers beneath the Vatican. What archaeologists found was a necropolis, a city of the dead littered with Roman graves, inscriptions, and mausoleums. In a niche, near a graffiti-covered wall, they uncovered bones, male, elderly, first century-ish. Perfect, right? Well, maybe. The Vatican immediately claimed these were the remains of St. Peter. But here's the catch. The bones were found not in the sarcophagus labeled as Peter's, but in a nearby niche. And they'd been moved. Possibly multiple times. Some experts argued they were too jumbled, too incomplete. Others noted that the supposed grave of Peter was suspiciously empty. And, curiously, the Vatican waited over 20 years before officially announcing the bones belonged to the apostle. During that time, tests were conducted but never published in full. The results? Vaguely described as consistent with Peter's profile, which is Vatican. Speak for, don't ask too many questions. The theory floating among skeptics is that the Vatican needed to anchor the legitimacy of its spiritual empire. Having Peter's tomb directly beneath the basilica was too symbolically potent to pass up. It closes the narrative loop. It roots the Church's authority in literal rock. Whether the remains are truly his or not becomes secondary to the fact that people believe they are. But there's another theory, more conspiratorial, more unsettling, that Peter isn't down there at all, that the bones belong to someone else entirely. Or worse, that Peter was never buried in Rome, and the entire tradition is a centuries-old PR campaign. Some even suggest there's another tomb, sealed and hidden, containing relics or remains that would shatter the Church's narrative beyond repair. Perhaps that's why the Vatican controls access so tightly. Because once you start digging, you find more than bones. You find contradictions, and sometimes you find giants. The Vatican's knowledge of giants. If you think the idea of giants is just bedtime nonsense or Game of Thrones runoff, you haven't spent enough time in the theological margins. According to apocryphal texts, folklore, and a surprising number of suppressed writings, giants, yes, literal giants, once roamed the earth. And some believe the Vatican knows far more about them than they let on. Let's rewind to the book of Genesis. Chapter 6. The sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and bore children, the Nephilim, giants, men of renown. It's a brief, cryptic passage that the Church has historically brushed aside as metaphor, except it's not alone. The Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and other banned texts go into graphic detail about these beings, how they were born, what they taught humanity, and how they eventually triggered divine wrath. Now, if you're a church sitting on 2 millennia of fragile theological real estate, the existence of giants poses a structural problem. It suggests that humans weren't the only intelligent beings walking around. It implies divine beings broke the rules. It turns Genesis into a cover-up story. Which brings us to the Vatican's alleged fossil vault. Some claim the Church has, in its possession, ancient remains, gigantic skulls, femurs taller than a man, and artifacts too large for human use. These weren't found in Europe, but in the ruins of Mesopotamia, Central Africa, and even the Americas regions tied to flood myths and stories of sky beings. And what does the Church do when it finds something problematic? Same as always, catalog, classify, and never ever display it. Instead, we get artistic nods, giants in medieval tapestries, towering angels in cathedrals, Goliath sanitized into metaphor. But the whispers persist. That beneath the Vatican, somewhere near the bones of saints, lie the remnants of a pre-Adamic race, ancient, intelligent, possibly divine. Some say the Church has tried to destroy these remains. Others believe they're studying them, trying to unlock whatever knowledge these giants held. Because if giants were real, then everything changes. The Bible becomes a survivor's manual. Myth becomes history. And humanity stops being the top of the spiritual food chain. Which might explain why the Vatican once handed full authority to a secretive order known for taking uncomfortable truths and locking them away forever. Secret Jesuit experiments. If there's any group within the Vatican that could plausibly be running secret experiments behind layers of candlelit diplomacy, it's the Jesuits. Officially known as the Society of Jesus, they are the Church's intellectual elite, the brainy enforcers with doctoral degrees and poker faces. Their motto? Ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God, which, depending on your level of paranoia, could either be inspiring or deeply ominous. Now, the Jesuits have long been accused of secret agendas. Conspiracy theorists blame them for everything from manipulating world governments to summoning spirits using Gregorian chant frequencies. Fun crowd. But buried under all the noise are claims that hint at something. Stranger alchemical research, psychic trials, consciousness studies, even early explorations into transdimensional travel. Think less, mad scientist in a lab coat, and more, priest with a crucifix and a journal full of sacred math. One particularly persistent story involves the Jesuits conducting experiments inside Vatican buildings, sealed to everyone but the order itself. These projects allegedly ranged from sensory deprivation and spiritual ecstasy trials to the development of soul mapping, a kind of metaphysical cartography intended to diagram the stages of divine transformation. Some say they were trying to locate the exact point at which the soul exits the body. Others claim they were looking for a way to trigger divine visions in a lab setting, part theology, part hallucinogenic chemistry. There's also talk of secret studies into ancient relics objects, thought to hold power over space, time, or consciousness. These weren't stored in museums. They were tested, meditated on, exposed to incantations, or locked in Faraday cages for reasons no one would explain. The Vatican denies all of it, of course. Jesuits are just deeply contemplative scholars, they say. But it's worth noting that the order has always had a flair for operating outside the usual ecclesiastical structures. They're bound directly to the Pope and historically have been used for special missions, diplomatic, scientific, even covert. Basically, if the Church had a spiritual CIA, it'd be wearing Jesuit robes. And if they've been experimenting with the building blocks of reality, or the edges of divinity, then you have to ask, what have they discovered that can't be published? What secrets are too dangerous even for belief? Because next on the list is a theory that gets right to the core of faith itself. Who exactly was Jesus Christ? And what might the Vatican not be telling us? The real identity of Jesus. Jesus Christ, Savior of mankind, carpenter from Nazareth, star of stained glass windows and global holidays. But according to some very persistent rumors, the man we think we know might not have been exactly who or what the Vatican says he was. And if you believe those rumors, the real story of Jesus is hidden in a sealed drawer somewhere beneath Vatican City, guarded more fiercely than the Sistine Chapel's temperature controls. Let's start with the tame stuff. Some theologians suggest Jesus had siblings, a wife, even children. Gospels like Thomas and Philip, conveniently labeled apocryphal, paint a version of Jesus that's more mystical sage than divine superhero. Others hint that Mary Magdalene wasn't just a close follower, but a partner. Spiritually, emotionally, maybe even biologically. Then, there's the wild stuff. Some ancient texts allude to Jesus having spent years studying in Egypt, Persia, or even India, gaining esoteric knowledge that later got rebranded as miracles. One particularly spicy theory suggests that his resurrection wasn't divine but medical, that he never died, merely entered a trance-like state and was revived. Early biohacking, 1st century edition. The Vatican has always dismissed these ideas as blasphemy or scholarly error, but the question remains, why does the Church suppress certain texts so aggressively? Why does it go to such lengths to maintain a singular, unyielding version of Jesus' life? Some believe it's because the truth would unravel everything. If Jesus was married, the doctrine of celibacy becomes optional. If he traveled the world, the claim of spiritual exclusivity collapses. And if he wasn't divine in the way we've been told, if he was simply a man who achieved transcendence, then salvation stops being a gift and starts becoming a skill, a teachable, repeatable path. Others take it even further, that the Vatican is sitting on genetic material, blood samples, bones, even DNA tests that prove Jesus' lineage isn't as miraculous as we thought. Or worse, that it island, but in a way that suggests alien origins, not divine. Of course, none of this can be proven. The documents, if they exist, are classified. The witnesses are long dead, but the silence, that's alive and well. And speaking of silence, the Vatican has never explained what really happened in 1307 when they turned on the Knights Templar, their most powerful allies. Some say it wasn't betrayal. It was containment. The Vatican's role in the Knights Templars' fall. The Knights Templar weren't your average holy warriors. These were battle-hardened monks with castles, banks, and a fleet of ships. They protected pilgrims, fought crusades, and pioneered the medieval version of offshore banking. At their peak, they were so wealthy and influential that the Pope himself needed their approval for major moves. And then one day, they were labeled heretics, arrested en masse, tortured into confessions, and burned at the stake. The Church's official reason? Heresy, occult rituals, devil worship, which, when you say it all at once, sounds suspiciously like a political hit disguised as a theological scandal. The real story might be murkier and darker. One theory suggests the Templars uncovered something during their time in the Holy Land. Not gold, not relics, knowledge. Specifically, ancient texts or artifacts buried beneath Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Maybe even the Holy Grail itself. Whatever it was, it made them dangerous. Some say the Templars began to question the Church's authority, that they developed a secret theology based on what they found something older than Christianity, something cosmically inconvenient. And when word of it reached Rome, the Vatican acted fast. Pope Clement V, under pressure or guidance from King Philip IV of France, initiated a purge. Overnight, the Templars went from papal darlings to demonic scapegoats. Their leaders were executed, their lands seized, and their order disbanded. But the most interesting part? The Vatican never actually declared the Templars heretical in any universal, lasting sense. The charges were vague, the evidence flimsy. It's as if the Church was saying, let's get rid of them, but let's not put anything too specific in writing. Why? Because maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe the Templars found something that shook the foundation of Church doctrine, something so profound it couldn't be unlearned. Some believe remnants of that knowledge still exist hidden in symbols, architecture, and coded documents. Others say the Vatican has the originals, tucked away in the archives, filed under something like Templum 37, A, do not open. Whatever they found, it was worth killing for, and silencing forever. Which makes you wonder, what other geniuses had their work erased by the Church before it could change the world? Let's ask Da Vinci, assuming, of course, the Church didn't already steal the answer. The lost writings of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was many things: painter, engineer, anatomist, architect, obsessive doodler of birds with far too many gears. But according to some Vatican whispernet theorists, he was also a prophet, one whose more inconvenient ideas may have been snatched, stashed, and sealed behind Vatican stone. Now, Da Vinci didn't hide the fact that he wasn't exactly church-friendly. His notebooks are littered with sketches of flying machines, dissected human corpses, and cryptic diagrams that look suspiciously like blueprints for post-apocalyptic survival. He was a man 500 years ahead of his time, which, by Renaissance standards, basically made him a witch with good handwriting. The Church tolerated him, admired his art, and probably squinted really hard at everything else. The mystery lies in his missing works. Thousands of pages of drawings, notes, and treatises that have never been found. Historians chalk it up to time, theft, or careless archives. But others believe the Church played a more active role. After all, Da Vinci didn't just paint angelic faces. He questioned biblical events, challenged Church doctrine, and may have encoded secret knowledge into his work. Take The Last Supper, for example. A painting so loaded with symbolic oddities, it's practically begging to be turned into a conspiracy PowerPoint. No halos, no chalice, strange hand gestures. Some even claim Mary Magdalene is sitting in it, disguised as one of the apostles. Coincidence? Possibly. But when you consider Da Vinci's obsession with symmetry and message layering, nothing in that image feels accidental. Some researchers believe that Leonardo's lost works contain radical cosmological ideas, reinterpretations of scripture, and perhaps even prophetic visions of technological futures. Not guesses, but blueprints. Designs for machines, theories about the soul, maps of metaphysical realms. The kind of material that would make a Renaissance cardinal spill his communion wine. The Vatican, for its part, says nothing. Some of Da Vinci's known works ended up in Church custody, particularly after his death. The rest? Scattered across Europe or gone entirely. But maybe not lost. Maybe just hidden. After all, if Leonardo truly glimpsed truths that threaten the Church's monopoly on salvation, if he encoded forbidden science in holy art, then keeping those writings out of public hands isn't just censorship, it's survival. And yet, even Leonardo's secrets feel tame compared to the visions that came later, ones so unsettling that the Vatican didn't even bother to deny them. They just never released them at all. Undisclosed Marian apparitions. Marian apparitions, the Virgin Mary popping in for an unannounced, radiant cameo, are one of the Church's favorite supernatural occurrences. When they're manageable, when they're sweet, symbolic, and come with just the right amount of tears and incense. But every now and then, Mary says something inconvenient. And when she does, the Vatican has a habit of quietly closing the blinds. While well-known apparitions like Fatima and Lourdes are celebrated, documented, and monetized through statue sales, there are others that never make it past the Vatican's internal inbox. These are the undisclosed or quietly buried cases where visionaries allegedly received disturbing messages too politically explosive, apocalyptically grim, or theologically heretical for mass consumption. Take, for instance, the rumors of apparitions in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. Multiple reports describe Mary appearing to children with visions of worldwide destruction, church corruption, and false shepherds in crimson robes. These were investigated briefly, then dismissed, not denied, not disproven, just not spoken of again. And then there's the supposed African sightings. In Rwanda, during the early 1982nd, several children claimed to see the Virgin Mary delivering messages of repentance and warning. The content? Harrowing. Predictions of violence, genocide, and rivers of blood. When the genocide began years later, many wondered if the Church had missed or buried the message. Official response? Delayed recognition. No follow-up, quiet shrugs. Why the silence? The Vatican claims it's to protect the faithful from confusion, which is a polite way of saying some truths are too ugly for prayer cards. But others believe the Church is protecting itself. Because if Mary's warnings include critiques of the Vatican or hint at a spiritual collapse within the clergy, they don't inspire faith, they inspire revolt. More chilling are the consistent themes across these undisclosed sightings: visions of fire raining from the sky, global darkness, and a voice that speaks from beneath the stones. Some claim that multiple apparitions have named names, popes, cardinals, even entire nations, and that the messages were logged, translated, and immediately classified. Which begs the question, if heaven is trying to send a warning, and the Vatican's job is to deliver it, who's really being protected? Because sometimes silence isn't peace, it's a cover-up, especially when the skies themselves begin acting strangely and the Church already has a file on it. The Vatican's observations of the 1561 Nuremberg sky battle, the 14th of April, 1561. The residents of Nuremberg, Germany, woke up to the celestial equivalent of a Michael Bay movie giant spheres, crosses, cylinders, and other unknown objects battling it out across the morning sky. Witnesses reported crashes, explosions, and a black spear-like object overseeing it all. It was documented in woodcut form by a local printer who, unlike modern skeptics, wasn't trying to sell alien t-shirts. Historians have tried to explain it away as sundogs, optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions. But here's the twist. The Vatican may have been watching. Records suggest that Church astronomers, already quite active at the time, were not only aware of the Nuremberg event, they kept their own notes. That in itself isn't shocking. The Church watched the skies religiously, punfully intended. But what is unsettling is that their commentary on the event has never been made public. Not a word, just silence. And you know the drill. When the Vatican says nothing, it usually means they said something very quietly, to themselves, and then buried it. Conspiracy theorists suggest the Nuremberg event was more than an anomaly. They say it was a clash between advanced non-human factions, possibly using Earth as a battleground. And the Vatican? They either recognized what it was or already knew about it. Some even claim the event was connected to prophecies buried in the Book of Enoch or the Revelation of Peter, with descriptions that eerily match the sky battle. One particularly unnerving rumor says that a Vatican delegation was dispatched afterward not to Nuremberg, but to a nearby monastery where a monk claimed to have received a divine interpretation of the event. What he wrote down was supposedly so disturbing, it was seized by church officials and never seen again. To this day, there's no official Vatican commentary on the Nuremberg phenomenon. And yet, references to similar heavenly conflicts can be found in medieval sermons, frescoes, and illuminated manuscripts tucked deep in Vatican archives. So was it just weather? Was it mass hysteria? Or did the church witness something they couldn't control and chose instead to pretend never happened? Because if they do know more, they've had centuries to hide it. Just like the next object in their closet of impossible artifacts, one that's been hunted for 1,000 years, but never found. The Holy Grail's real location. The Holy Grail has been called many things: the cup of Christ, the chalice from the Last Supper, a vessel of divine power, or, depending on which speculative historian you ask, a metaphor for hidden bloodlines, suppressed truths, and ancient technology masquerading as sacred crockery. Whatever it actually is, or was the Vatican, might know exactly where it island and has for a very, very long time. Let's start with the obvious problem. No one can agree on what the Grail even island. A cup? A stone? A person? The entire Arthurian legendarium is basically medieval fan fiction layered over older legends, with a generous sprinkle of church redactions. But through all the rewrites, one thread remains. The Grail holds divine knowledge or power, and someone important doesn't want it found. And when it comes to suppressing dangerous spiritual artifacts, the Vatican has centuries of practice and an impeccable track record. The theory goes that the Grail was discovered during the Crusades, possibly by the Knights Templar, and transported back to Europe. But instead of being displayed, worshipped, or put in a glass case with a polite Latin plaque, it was quietly handed over to the Vatican. Why? Because the Grail's real power wasn't symbolic. It was literal, whether that meant healing, immortality, or insight into the divine mechanics of the universe depends on which manuscript you're reading at 3 a.m. Some claim the Vatican tested it. Others say it's hidden beneath Vatican Hill, encased in a sealed vault alongside other relics deemed too destabilizing for public faith. A few even believe the Grail isn't an object at all, but a lineage descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, protected or hunted by church agents across the centuries, a living truth too messy for doctrine. The Vatican, predictably, denies all of this. They acknowledge many relics, bits of cross, thorns from the crown, enough saintly finger bones to raise questions about divine limb multiplication, but the Grail? Just a myth, a legend, a literary device. Sure, and we all believe in legends until they get too close to the truth. Because if the Grail really does grant access to divine power, knowledge, or lineage, it's the one relic the church can't risk falling into the wrong hands. Especially when its trail might have begun long before the Gospels were ever written in a library the church once claimed was lost to history, the missing Library of Alexandria scrolls. Ah, the Library of Alexandria, the intellectual Atlantis of antiquity. The place where the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, cosmology, and probably a few demonic cookbooks, was supposedly reduced to ash. A cultural tragedy, a cautionary tale, and maybe a cover story. Because what if the scrolls weren't lost? What if they were relocated? The Vatican has long been suspected of having access to texts believed destroyed in the Alexandrian fire. Not copies, not fragments, originals. Scrolls written in ancient Greek, Egyptian, Sumerian, and languages we haven't even classified yet. Texts that contain knowledge incompatible with medieval doctrine and, frankly, modern science. Here's the scenario. As Alexandria faced repeated attacks and political instability, scholars, many of them loyal to the early Christian church, smuggled out what they could. Some of those works were transferred to Rome, where they were preserved, but preservation turned quickly into suppression. After all, if your goal is to build a monotheistic empire, you don't want rival cosmologies lying around explaining the universe in non-divine terms. And what kind of things might those scrolls contain? Mathematical models of heliocentrism centuries before Copernicus. Anatomical knowledge that makes medieval medicine look like guesswork. Astronomical charts tracking stellar cycles over tens of thousands of years. Ritual systems for inducing altered states of consciousness that modern pharmacology still hasn't replicated. Not bad for scrolls written in the era of sandals and goat hair robes. But the biggest rumor? That the lost scrolls included ancient accounts of pre-cataclysmic civilizations, Atlantis, Lemuria, or other lost cultures whose knowledge, technologies, and spiritual systems threaten to overshadow the biblical narrative. Some say the scrolls referenced beings that came from the stars, taught mankind agriculture, law, and metallurgy, then disappeared, or were cast down, a familiar theme if you've been reading between the lines in Genesis. Of course, the Vatican maintains that they've never had such scrolls. But if they did, you can bet they'd be locked far beneath the Apostolic Archive in a section labeled "Do Not Translate Without a Papal Mandate." And that's the real tragedy. Not just what humanity might have lost, but what might still be hidden. Because if the scrolls do exist, they don't just threaten church authority. They rewrite the human story. And that's a story the Vatican has been editing for centuries, especially when it comes to the ideas it labeled heresy. The Vatican's role in covering up heretical teachings. If there's one thing the Catholic Church does better than gilding ceilings and crafting Latin titles for sin, it's burying ideas, dangerous ideas. Ideas that contradict the carefully curated, centuries-long narrative of salvation, authority, and doctrinal purity. And when it came to heresy, the Vatican didn't just debate it, deleted. The Gnostics, the Cathars, the Bogomils, the Manichaeans. These weren't small-time cults practicing interpretive dance in basements. These were fully developed theological movements with their own scriptures, initiation rites, and most dangerously, their own versions of truth. Versions that didn't require popes, sacraments, or tithe payments. Take the Gnostics, for example. They believed salvation came from inner knowledge, not obedience to a church hierarchy. They painted Jesus as a teacher of divine self-realization, not a blood sacrifice to appease a wrathful God. And their texts? Explosive. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, all offering radically different portraits of the divine. So what did the Vatican do? Declared them heretical, launched inquisitions, burned the books, and executed the believers. Some teachings survived in fragments, buried in desert caves or passed down through secret lineages. Others, it's rumored, were seized, not destroyed, and added to the Vatican's growing library of inconvenient theology. Because here's the irony. For all their fire and fury, the Church rarely threw anything truly valuable away. They archived it, studied it, hid it. Some even believe the Vatican has a separate archive, not for official doctrine, but for suppressed heresies, categorized, translated, and sealed, not because they believe them, but because they might be right. There are whispers of entire gospels stored away, scrolls written by early female disciples, texts that suggest reincarnation was once part of Christian belief, accounts of Christ's teachings that focus on union with the divine, not submission to it, even manuscripts that equate God and Satan as two halves of a cosmic polarity, a theological black hole for an institution built on absolute dualism. The Church insists this is nonsense. Of course they do, but the pattern is unmistakable. When a teaching empowers the individual without needing a middleman in Rome, it gets erased. Or worse, misquoted into compliance. And if they've been covering up the truth about divine beings for centuries, what do they really know about the forces we call angels and demons? The true nature of angels and demons. In Catholic tradition, angels are glowing, winged agents of heavenly love and guidance, and demons are shrieking hell beasts with pitchforks and a grudge. That's the Sunday school version. The one with watercolor cherubs and cartoon horns? But the deeper you dig into ancient theology, exorcism files, and banned apocrypha, the more that simple dichotomy starts to collapse. And the Vatican? They've been tiptoeing around that collapse for centuries. Let's begin with the angels. Not the hallmark kind, the biblical ones. They're terrifying. Multi-eyed, wheel-shaped, burning with flame and secrecy. When they appear to humans, the first thing they usually say is, "Do not be afraid." Which is something you only say when you're the kind of creature that makes grown men drop their wine and rethink their life. Some ancient texts, like the Book of Enoch and the writings of early Christian mystics, suggest that angels aren't messengers at all, but forces of nature with intelligence, cosmic laws wrapped in consciousness. Others go further, describing interactions that feel suspiciously extraterrestrial, blinding lights, vibrations, altered time perception, voices that come from inside your skull. If it sounds like a close encounter, that's because it might be, and the Vatican has definitely noticed. Then there are the demons. In early texts, they're not always fallen angels. Sometimes they're just different, older, pre-Adamic entities, chaotic and neutral, until corrupted or enslaved by spiritual forces. The Church eventually retconned all of them into Satan's army for narrative simplicity. But the truth may be stranger. Some demons behave less like moral villains and more like spiritual algorithms gone rogue, predictable, manipulable, and deeply bound to ritual laws. This gray area gets especially blurry in the exorcism files the Vatican refuses to release. Priests have reported possessions that respond to Hebrew, not Latin. Others where the demon claims to be an angel, miscast by human misunderstanding. Some even say entities have accused the Church of hiding their true names, sacred words stripped from Scripture and locked in unshared texts. Why the secrecy? Because if angels and demons are not good and evil, but simply energies, intelligences, archetypes, then the entire morality engine of salvation theology grinds to a halt. It becomes about navigation, not obedience. And that's a dangerous thing to teach your flock, especially when another secret society might have been teaching it already right under the Vatican's nose. The Secret Order of the Sion Priory. It sounds like something invented by a bored novelist with too many conspiracy books and not enough social life. A shadowy organization known as the Priory of Sion, allegedly guarding the bloodline of Christ, the sacred feminine, or the roadmap to divine consciousness depending on which thread you pull. But as absurd as it sounds, there are documents, references, and enough Vaticans squirming to suggest they weren't just a myth. According to legend, the Priory of Sion dates back to the First Crusade, founded to protect a secret unearthed beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Some say it was a collection of ancient scrolls. Others, the tomb of Mary Magdalene. And then there are the ones who go full throttle into chaos and claim they found proof that Jesus and Mary had children, a bloodline, a lineage. The Vatican, understandably, hates this theory, because if Christ had descendants, then the Church is no longer the sole bridge between humanity and God. You don't need priests, you need a DNA test. The Priory allegedly maintained this secret through generations, encoding messages in Gothic cathedrals, Renaissance paintings, and obscure books that only make sense if you've had a near-death experience and a bottle of absinthe. They were said to operate in the shadows, sometimes protecting the Vatican, sometimes opposing it, depending on who was Pope and how many secrets he was hoarding. And there's a reason why this story refuses to die. Because every few decades, something surfaces, an encoded manuscript, an altered genealogy, a Vatican scandal involving mysterious lost artifacts, and the Priory theory surges back into public imagination. The Church has always denied it. Officially, the Priory is a modern hoax based on forged documents. But the Vatican's denials have a funny habit of sounding like admissions delivered with better lighting. Some believe the Priory was eventually absorbed by the Vatican, its original purpose buried, its members silenced or bought off. Others think it still exists, hiding in plain sight, possibly within the Church itself, waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth that would detonate the doctrine from the inside. Because if someone's guarding the bloodline of Christ, they don't need to overthrow the Vatican, they just need to outlive it. And perhaps they already have. Especially when the Church itself has been known to fund secret missions to dig up forbidden knowledge. Vatican-led archaeological missions. Most people don't think of the Vatican as a hotbed of archaeological adventurism. It's more famous for incense and Latin than for dusty digs in remote deserts. But behind the cassocks and catechisms lies a quiet, methodical obsession with the ancient world, one that involves secret excavations, classified discoveries, and fieldwork you'll never see in a museum brochure. The Vatican has its own Pontifical Academy of Archaeology, with deep ties to sites in the Middle East, North Africa, and occasionally places that don't show up on any tourist map. According to multiple reports, some credible, some whispered by people who collect skulls in basements, the Vatican has sponsored digs in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even Antarctica. Not to preserve history, but to find something older than history. In Egypt, they've allegedly searched for early Christian sects who fled Roman persecution and took with them gospels that never made the final cut. In Mesopotamia, the goal may have been even stranger, recovering pre-biblical tablets referencing gods that fell from the sky, advanced cities, or technologies described in poetic but unsettling terms. And Antarctica? That's where things get unhinged. The theory is that the Vatican, alongside other shadowy groups, participated in a covert expedition to ancient ruins discovered beneath the ice. Structures not built by any known civilization, writings in languages that predate Sumerian, artifacts that seem to blur the line between ritual and machinery. Why would the Church care about any of this? Because archaeology isn't just about pottery, it's about control. Control of the timeline, the origin story, the cosmological first draft. And the more you uncover, the harder it becomes to justify dogma, especially when what you're digging up contradicts scripture word for word. Rumors persist of findings that were immediately removed, classified, and never seen again. Inscriptions describing non-human teachers, maps of Earth before the last ice age, and relics that suggest humanity is older, weirder, and far less alone than we ever thought. Official Vatican response? Silence. Occasionally, a press release about preserving cultural heritage. But the real treasures, the ones that could rewrite the narrative, are nowhere to be found. Because when you find something buried that shakes the pillars of your theology, you don't put it on display. You bury it deeper. The curse of the Vatican obelisk. In the center of St. Peter's Square, surrounded by 284 columns, sits a giant red granite needle piercing the sky, an Egyptian obelisk older than Christianity itself. Brought to Rome under Emperor Caligula, it once stood in the Circus of Nero, watching over chariot races, executions, and the occasional crucifixion, including, according to tradition, St. Peter's. Now, this 3-foot-tall relic of empire, conquest, and sun worship rests at the symbolic heart of the Catholic Church. And depending on who you ask, that's either poetic irony or a cosmic mistake. Because this particular obelisk, it comes with baggage. Some believe it carries a curse, a subtle, ancient energy that predates the Vatican but now pulses at its core. Not a movie-style death curse, mind you. No priests bursting into flames. This one's more insidious, It allegedly warps intention, accelerates decay, or attracts chaos in slow bureaucratic waves, plagues, fires, corruption scandals. A few historians have pointed out that every time the Vatican faces a major existential crisis, it somehow aligns with significant events around the obelisk reconsecrations, restorations, ritual processions. Coincidence? Maybe. But here's the eerie part. It's one of the few monuments in Vatican City that has never been altered religiously. No crucifix, no saints, no overt Christian symbolism. Just a pagan needle, impaled in the holy ground, and quietly left to stand. Some scholars argue it's intentional, that the obelisk was left untouched because the church couldn't cleanse it, because its original purpose was not simply decorative, but metaphysical. Egyptian obelisks were designed to channel the power of the sun god Ra. They were pillars of cosmic energy, anchors of divine light. In placing it dead center in the Vatican's most sacred space, some say the church may have unintentionally turned their city into a ritual mirror of ancient solar worship. Others believe it wasn't unintentional at all, that certain Vatican insiders wanted it there, that behind the scenes, ancient symbols and alignments are very much understood and used. A convergence of power, faith, and geometry to shape the unseen. But even if it's just a rock, just a monument, it's the wrong symbol in the wrong place. A foreign god's monument embedded in the epicenter of Christian authority. And if you think that's an accident, wait until you see the ancient maps they're hiding. Maps that show continents that no longer exist. Ancient maps of the pre-flood world. Tucked away in forgotten manuscripts, obscure cartographic scrolls, and allegedly in the deepest vaults of the Vatican archives, are maps that don't match our world. Not our current world, anyway. These maps depict landmasses that are now ocean floors, coastlines that defy modern tectonics, Antarctica ice-free, submerged cities dotting the Atlantic, internal structures beneath mountain ranges that modern satellites only recently confirmed, all drawn centuries before sonar or aerial photography ever existed. The most infamous of these, some say derived from older sources, suggest the existence of a pre-flood Earth, a world before the deluge. The one hinted at in Genesis, Sumerian myths, and every culture that describes a time when the gods walked with men and humanity lived alongside beings of great renown. So where did these maps come from? According to some researchers, the originals were compiled from antediluvian sources, Atlantean records, scrolls salvaged from before the Great Flood, or transmitted knowledge passed down from civilizations long erased. Many of the copies known today have mysterious gaps, erasures, or annotations in Latin that warn against revealing the truth. And this is where the Vatican allegedly enters the picture. There's a persistent theory that the Church holds original versions of these maps more detailed, more complete acquired during the Crusades, secret expeditions, or looted from the ruins of destroyed libraries. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're theological time bombs. Because if they're accurate, they confirm several things the Church has spent centuries denying. Human civilization is far older than Genesis claims. Ancient cultures had knowledge of Earth's geography that rivals or surpasses ours today. The flood wasn't a metaphor. It was an extinction-level reset. The implications are massive. If such maps exist, they don't just challenge history, they invalidate doctrine, especially doctrines based on timelines, divine intervention, and humanity's place in the cosmos. Of course, the Vatican would never display them, not publicly, but some insiders claim they're there locked in a sealed cabinet, studied only by select scholars under oath. Because once you admit the past had global knowledge, you have to ask who or what gave it to them. And once you open that door, Judas walks in. The real story behind Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot, the original traitor, the man whose name became shorthand for betrayal, who allegedly sold out Jesus for 30 silver coins and a midnight kiss, the ultimate villain in a story of divine tragedy. Or was he? For centuries, the Church's narrative on Judas has remained tight and clean: greedy, weak, satangent, influenced, done. But then something inconvenient happened. In the 1972nd, a papyrus codex was discovered in Egypt, a long-lost gospel attributed to Judas himself. Cue the Vatican scooting its chair back a few inches. The Gospel of Judas flips the story upside down. In it, Jesus doesn't rebuke Judas. He recruits him, privately. He tells him that he is the only apostle who truly understands his divine nature, and that Judas must be the one to betray him to fulfill the cosmic plan. In this version, Judas isn't a villain. He's the only one doing what Jesus actually asked for. The Church, unsurprisingly, was not a fan. The document was called heretical, apocryphal, and misleading. The Vatican downplayed its significance, but they couldn't erase it. The text exists. It challenges not just the Judas narrative, but the entire concept of divine martyrdom. It reframes the crucifixion as a conscious, planned exit, and Judas as the gatekeeper, not the betrayer, but the initiator of sacred transformation. If that's true, then Christian doctrine as we know it, sin, guilt, salvation through sacrifice, loses its keystone. The Vatican has refused to authenticate the Gospel of Judas fully, despite knowing about its existence long before it became public. Some believe they possess earlier, more complete versions that delve deeper into Gnostic cosmology, secret teachings of Jesus, and an entirely different view of humanity's relationship with the divine. And if Judas was chosen, not condemned? If the entire narrative of betrayal was just theological misdirection? Then forgiveness isn't just possible, it's built into the design. The enemy was never Judas. It was misunderstanding, and maybe control. A theme that reappears, again and again, especially in the stories the Vatican edits out, like the places so horrific they don't dare release the full transcripts. Visions that go beyond fire and brimstone. Visions of hell that were censored for being too real. Censored visions of hell. Hell has always been the Church's most effective marketing tool. Nothing motivates repentance like eternal fire, endless screams, and demons enthusiastically auditioning for a metal album cover. But as terrifying as the official version is, there are darker, deeper, far more disturbing visions, ones the Vatican has chosen not to share with the public. Or, if they have, only in bite-sized, heavily redacted morsels designed not to incite mass panic or spontaneous atheism. The Catholic mystics have long claimed to glimpse the afterlife, often through near-death experiences, ecstatic trances, or good old-fashioned divine horror shows. But some of those visions were deemed too intense, too chaotic, or too uncomfortable for the Church to fully endorse. Take Saint Faustina. Her visions of hell, partially published in her diaries, describe soul-shattering torment. Yet parts of her accounts were omitted, sealed, or edited under the justification of pastoral discretion. In other words, people might freak out. There are reports that she saw not only demons, but souls of clergy members, yes, priests and bishops burning for secret sins never revealed in life. Then there's Padre Pio, the stigmata-bearing mystic whose visions were often vague in public, but said to be deeply graphic in private. Letters exist, some heavily censored, where he alludes to suffering that goes beyond the fire, involving levels of spiritual agony not found in any catechism. And those are the visions that made it to daylight. Rumors persist of modern nuns and monks, mostly cloistered mystics, who have reported apocalyptic imagery. Children dragged into caverns of despair, bureaucratic demons administering eternal punishments like soul tax collectors, and entire forgotten heavens twisted into ironic punishments for those who misused faith. The Vatican, for its part, doesn't deny these visions happened. They just discourage dwelling on them. They prefer the abstract, the metaphorical. Because when hell starts sounding like a cosmic penal colony run by fallen administrators instead of a theological abstraction, things get messy. People ask questions about justice, about mercy, about whether eternal punishment even makes sense. But perhaps that's the point. Maybe these censored visions aren't warnings. Maybe they're commentary. A glimpse into the spiritual consequences of institutional control. And if those visions are too terrifying to release, what else is hiding in plain sight? Perhaps something carved in marble and painted in gold symbols everyone sees, but no one is supposed to understand. Occult symbols in the Vatican. Walk through the Vatican and you'll be bathed in beauty. Frescoes, domes, mosaics, priceless art everywhere. But look closer, really closer, and you start to notice things. Odd symbols. Alchemical motifs. Zodiac wheels. Eyes within triangles. Staffs entwined with serpents. Pagan deities painted into the margins of saints' lives. And that's when the Vatican starts looking less like a house of worship and more like a spiritual decoding puzzle created by someone with too many secrets and a flair for irony. Yes, the Church is aware. And yes, it has explanations. Artistic context, symbolic inheritance, classical influence. But let's not pretend the seat of Catholic power is just a glorified Renaissance museum with a theology problem. Many of these symbols trace back to pre-Christian or esoteric sources: Hermeticism, Kabbalah, astrology, and Egyptian mythology. They didn't just slip in, they were invited. Take the pine cone statue in the Vatican's courtyard. Pine cones, in esoteric traditions, represent the pineal gland, the third eye, spiritual awakening, divine perception. So why does a religion that warns against occult knowledge have the world's largest pine cone shrine sitting between two papal buildings? Or the keys of St. Peter usually shown crossed, one gold and one silver, a symbol of papal authority, sure. But also, in alchemical texts, the dual keys of transformation, the spiritual and the material, the sun and the moon. The symbol appears in magical grimoires centuries before it became a Vatican logo. Even the architectural layout of Vatican City has been called into question. Certain alignments between obelisks, domes, and solar markers mirror ancient sun-worship temples. Coincidence? Or are we dealing with a sacred geometry passed down through esoteric channels and rebranded for ecclesiastical use? Some believe that hidden within these symbols are messages, not blasphemies, but truths. That early church scholars encoded deeper spiritual meanings within the art, knowing the masses would never notice. That what looks like idolatry is actually an instruction manual for transcendence. The Vatican's official stance? Art is complex, meanings evolve, which is technically true, and also a perfect way to avoid answering anything. But if the Vatican is actively using occult symbols to communicate hidden knowledge, you have to ask, who are they communicating with? Because if you think the Church is only at odds with the occult, you've clearly never heard about the whispers connecting it to one of its oldest enemies, the Vatican's relationship with Freemasonry. Few rivalries are as theatrically tense as the one between the Catholic Church and the Freemasons. One's a centuries-old religious empire in white and gold. The other's a secretive network of handshakes, aprons, and architectural metaphors. And yet, behind the scenes, their histories are so entangled you could bind them with red string and pin it to a corkboard labeled Religious Conspiracies 101. Officially, the Vatican has condemned Freemasonry since 1738. The papal bulls are relentless. Catholics joining the Masons? Excommunicated, period. The reasons given range from Masonic secrecy, oaths, and naturalism to vague plots against the Church. And yet, somehow, the connection refuses to die. Why? Because despite all the condemnations, Freemasonry keeps showing up in Vatican history. Cryptic letters, scandals, quiet resignations, Rumors of high-ranking clergy who were members in secret. Allegedly, some popes were approached by, or even part of Masonic circles before their ascension. Once enthroned, they either cut ties or worked from within. Some claim Masonic influence peaked during the 20th century, particularly in Vatican banking scandals, theological liberalism, and secretive factions that pushed for radical reforms or controlled collapse. One persistent rumor alleges the existence of P2, a Masonic lodge with deep Vatican infiltration during the 1972nd and 82nd. It's been blamed for everything from assassinations to blackmail schemes, depending on how far down the rabbit hole you go. And let's not forget the symbolism overlap. Twin pillars, blazing stars, eyes within triangles. While the Church calls these Christian or artistic, others see fingerprints of Masonic cosmology, subtle nods to a brotherhood that allegedly never really left. So, is it infiltration, mutual utility, or something even stranger like a theological Cold War, where both sides hide their true purpose behind rituals and rhetoric? One thing's certain, the Vatican has never backed off its anti-Masonic stance, but it's also never quite cleaned house. The smoke never fully clears, the whispers never stop. And if Masons really did walk the marble halls of the Holy See, they would have brought their own death rituals, secrets, and symbols. Perhaps even influencing how popes themselves are buried, in ways the public isn't allowed to see. Secret burial rituals for popes. Most people think a pope dies and gets gently laid to rest after a few days of solemn organ music and public veneration. A crowd gathers, someone cries, a little Latin is chanted, the cameras pan respectfully. But that's the version for the faithful, the cinematic one. What's not televised are the stranger parts, the private, ritual-heavy moments that only a small, elite circle of clergy witnesses. The things that happen behind the sealed doors of St. Peter's Basilica once the television crews pack up and the cardinals exchange somber handshakes. These are the secret burial rituals. And if the whispers are true, they are far older and far more occult than anyone dares admit. The official Vatican process goes like this. When a pope dies, the Camerlengo, the Church's administrator during the interregnum, verifies death with a silver hammer and an ancient chant. Then, the fisherman's ring is destroyed, documents are sealed, and the Pope's body is embalmed, dressed, and placed in a series of coffins, 3 of them in fact. A nested trinity of wood, lead, and cypress, like a holy Russian doll. But that's only what's released to the public. The rest is murky. Some claim that each pope undergoes a death rite involving ancient prayers never uttered outside this chamber, that a special manuscript different from the Roman ritual is used during these proceedings. Not for sanctification, but for containment. The theory is that popes, having wielded immense spiritual authority, leave behind a residue, a metaphysical echo, and the Church, in its paranoia or wisdom, treats that as both sacred and dangerous. Other accounts suggest relics are buried with the Pope, items of personal power, talismans, encrypted scrolls known only to the College of Cardinals. There's even speculation that part of the burial ritual involves a whispered confession not to another man, but to a sealed reliquary, an object that absorbs the final truths of a pontiff and locks them away. Why so elaborate? Some say it's insurance. That popes, being both spiritual leaders and political actors, die with secrets so incendiary, they must be buried in layers, ritual, steel, and stone. Others think it's legacy management, a way to bind the spiritual authority of a pope back into the vault of the Church, so no trace of personal divinity lingers. But what happens when visions go unheeded? When warnings are given and no one listens? The answer might be written not in Rome, but in Rwanda. The Vatican's silence on apparitions in Rwanda and Africa. Between 1981 and 1989, in the small Rwandan village of Kibeho, a series of Marian apparitions occurred that shook witnesses to their core. The Virgin Mary appeared to several schoolgirls, delivering messages that were not gentle, glowing proclamations of love and hope, but chilling visions of fire, blood, and death, rivers of corpses. "Fields of slaughter!" the children screamed during their trances. One wept for days afterward. And then, in 1994, Rwanda descended into genocide. Over 800,000 people were slaughtered in 100 days. It was one of the most efficient, horrific mass killings of the 20th century. And the apparitions? They had predicted it, with disturbing precision. So, what did the Vatican do? Eventually, in 2001, 7 years after the genocide, it approved the Marian apparitions of Kibeho as worthy of belief. A quiet nod, a bureaucratic whisper. But during the actual events, during the run-up to the massacre, silence. Why? Because these apparitions weren't convenient. They didn't reaffirm faith, they questioned it. They suggested that even prayer might not be enough. That darkness, real and material, would rise regardless. And worse, they showed suffering in such unfiltered detail that many wondered whether it was even divine, or something else masquerading as it. Some believe the Vatican investigated the Kibeho visions far more deeply than it admits, that there were internal reports detailing names, locations, prophecies too specific to be coincidental. And instead of releasing them, they were sealed, filed, ignored. Other African apparitions have received similar treatment visions that speak of injustice, political corruption, and spiritual betrayal. And every time, the Church responds with cautious delays or complete silence, as though the message is less important than the setting, as though holy visions must only occur in places that already look good in stained glass. But if heaven truly speaks through the humble, the poor, the forgotten, why is the Vatican so afraid of those voices? Maybe it's because they cut too close, because they see too clearly, because the divine doesn't always look like a Michelangelo painting. It sometimes looks like grief, smoke, and judgment. And maybe it's because some secrets can't be silenced with prayer, only with money. The Vatican's black budget. Here's a fun thought. What does an ancient religious institution with priceless art and real estate in every major city and no obligation to disclose its finances really spend its money on? Spoiler. Probably not just candles and choir robes. Enter the Vatican's black budget, a term whispered among financial watchdogs, conspiracy theorists, and a few very nervous accountants. The idea is simple and deeply unsettling, that the Vatican operates with a secret, untraceable financial reserve, not just for rainy days or real estate acquisitions, but for projects that never appear in any annual report, projects that require absolute secrecy. We're talking about funding covert archaeological digs, undisclosed scientific experiments, and yes, alleged intelligence operations. Everything from smuggling ancient relics out of war zones to financing entire think tanks focused on the compatibility of quantum physics and theology. There are even claims that part of this hidden budget supports surveillance networks not just for security, but to monitor religious phenomena worldwide. Where does the money come from? Some of it's hidden in plain sight. Investments in global markets, discrete shell companies, donor networks funneled through tax-exempt entities. Some believe large sums are siphoned from the Vatican Bank itself, a financial institution already notorious for secrecy, corruption scandals, and the occasional unexplained suicide. And where does it go? That's the real mystery, because no one outside a handful of Vatican insiders has access to the full picture. The black budget exists in shadows, an accounting system layered in religious immunity, diplomatic privilege, and enough Latin to make any forensic auditor cry. But the implications are serious. If the Church is quietly funding projects meant to reshape public belief, rewrite history, or conceal cosmic truths, then it's not just guarding doctrine. It's managing reality, selectively, surgically, expensively. And when information is that dangerous and that expensive, it usually means one thing. Someone doesn't want it translated. Someone doesn't want it read. Someone is sitting on texts that could unravel everything. Which brings us to the scrolls so sacred, they've never been fully shown to the world. Not because we can't read them, but because we shouldn't. Untranslated Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. A massive cache of ancient Jewish texts hidden in desert caves and accidentally found by a goat herder with zero interest in eschatology. Since then, scholars have spent decades painstakingly translating the thousands of fragile fragments. They've uncovered portions of the Hebrew Bible, apocryphal works, temple rituals, and esoteric writings that offer a radically expanded view of Second Temple Judaism. But here's the catch. Not all of them have been translated, and some may never be. The official story is that the remaining scrolls are too damaged, too fragmentary, or too mundane to prioritize. But a persistent undercurrent of rumor suggests otherwise, that certain scrolls contain material so theologically disruptive, so cosmologically insane, that they've been quietly pulled from circulation. Not destroyed, just removed, into the vaults, into the silence, into the Vatican. Now wait, aren't the scrolls held in Israel, not Rome? Yes, mostly. But scholars from many institutions have accessed them, and the Vatican has had more than enough time and means to obtain copies, microfilms, or full translations of the texts that matter. The ones that mention angels with names that don't appear in the Bible? The ones that describe a war in heaven fought not in metaphor, but in architecture? The ones that detail the origins of humanity in terms that make Genesis look like a toddler's bedtime story? One scroll, allegedly kept out of public hands, describes a book of the Watchers in far greater detail than the versions found in Enoch. Another hints at an early priestly caste, in possession of non-human knowledge, possibly astronomical, possibly alchemical. And then there are whispers of a scroll, written in an unknown language, using characters not found in any known Semitic system, a language that resembles uncomfortably symbols found in esoteric Catholic architecture. So why hasn't the Church demanded full transparency? Because maybe they already know. Maybe they've known for centuries. Maybe they were hoping the scrolls wouldn't be found. And now, in some Vatican vault, there's a text so ancient, so dissonant, it sits untranslated, not because we can't read it, but because doing so might collapse the fragile bridge between religion and the myth it's built upon. And if that doesn't raise eyebrows, maybe what's carved into the rings worn by the men who run the Church will. Mysterious papal rings. To most eyes, the papal ring, the so-called ring of the fisherman, is a symbol of authority. A golden seal stamped on documents and kissed in deference. It's ceremonial, traditional, holy. But, like everything else with symbolic weight in the Vatican, the ring might also be hiding something else. More than one, actually. Over the centuries, different popes have commissioned different rings. Some are plain, others elaborate. But a few those rumored to exist outside the Vatican's display cases are said to be deeply esoteric. Engraved with symbols more often found in alchemical texts than scripture. Designs involving planetary glyphs, celestial alignments, or numerological patterns that don't align with Christian liturgy, but scream hermeticism and occult correspondence. Take the rumor of the Midnight Ring, allegedly passed only to popes deemed part of an inner esoteric circle. Said to be cast in blackened gold, engraved with the seal of Solomon, and worn only during certain rituals not listed in any Vatican press release. The existence of such a ring has never been confirmed naturally, but its mention recurs in accounts from former insiders, hidden memoirs, and anonymous letters sent to fringe historians who specialize in that sort of thing. Other papal rings are rumored to hold relic fragments, slivers of saintly bone, soil from Golgotha, even splinters of unknown origin encased beneath gemstone settings. It sounds theatrical, but the Church is no stranger to theatrical sacred symbolism. And sometimes, those symbols go unspoken because they suggest a lineage of secret knowledge rather than divine appointment. Some researchers believe certain rings serve as talismans, encoded with planetary alignments meant to be worn during celestial events. Others are said to contain inscriptions in languages not used by the Church, Enochian, for instance, or Paleo-Hebrew. Why would a pope need a ring that references angels not recognized by canonical scripture? Because maybe the ring isn't about ruling the Church, maybe it's about guarding something, or participating in something. A ritual lineage passed from one pope to the next, a covenant older than Peter, older than Rome. The public version of the papal ring is destroyed upon a pope's death to prevent forgery. But what about the other rings? The ones that aren't meant to be seen. The ones that disappear. The ones that may have belonged to popes you've never heard of because their very names were scrubbed from history. Unknown popes. If there's one thing the Vatican is good at besides bureaucracy and sculpted ceilings, it's controlling narrative. And at the top of that narrative sits the papal succession, a sacred chain unbroken since Street Peter. Every pope accounted for, every name in line, every transition divinely ordained and historically verified. Except, maybe not. Scattered across church history are hints, whispers, and suspicious gaps, moments where the timeline goes foggy, popes who reigned for weeks, even days, and were never officially canonized. Figures mentioned in obscure manuscripts or coded references who were erased entirely from Vatican records. Some call them anti-popes, rival claimants to the throne during periods of schism or chaos. But others? They might have been legitimate popes, elected under secret conditions, removed for reasons never explained. Why erase a pope? Politics, yes. Heresy, sure. But some theories go further. That these unknown popes didn't just disagree with the Church, they threatened to reveal things, forbidden doctrines, secret texts, hidden bloodlines, and the only solution was to delete them, not excommunicate, unexist. There's one story, half legend, half Vatican migraine, about a pope who reigned for less than a day. No coronation, no public appearance. Just a whispered conclave, a mysterious name, and a burial so secret no tomb was ever marked. Some say he attempted to open the archives to the public. Others claim he received a vision that contradicted church doctrine so violently he was declared theologically unstable. And let's not forget the centuries, where documentation is spotty. The early medieval period is a swamp of inconsistencies, duplicated names, suspiciously short reigns, and political chaos ripe for manipulation. A pope vanishing from history during a regime change wouldn't be difficult. Just a few edited manuscripts, a few destroyed seals, a rewritten chronicle or two, boom, he's gone. But if even one pope was erased, just one, it means the line is not unbroken. It means the system can be altered, that infallibility is flexible. And if they're willing to erase a pope, imagine what else they'd erase? Like, say, a 5-year-old girl who vanished inside Vatican walls and became the ghost story Rome still can't explain. The disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi. On a summer day in 1983, a 5-year-old girl named Emanuela Orlandi left her Vatican City apartment to attend a flute lesson in Rome and vanished. No struggle, no witnesses, just gone. A Vatican citizen, the daughter of a papal employee, swallowed whole by the shadows between sacred marble and secular asphalt. And for the next 40 years, her disappearances clung to the Vatican like incense to silk. At first, it seemed like a standard missing persons case. Posters, phone calls, pleas from family. But then came the calls, the strange ones. Anonymous voices speaking in riddles. References to political prisoners. Threats demanding the release of Mehmet Ali Akka, the man who attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II. Then more silence. The Vatican's response? Glacial. Official statements. Occasional nods of sympathy, but no action, no transparency, and certainly no urgency. Despite the fact that Orlandi lived within Vatican walls, a city-state with its own security force, its own intelligence channels, and allegedly, eyes everywhere. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Some say she was abducted as leverage in international espionage. Others believe she was taken by members of the Vatican Bank's criminal underbelly, a sacrifice, a pawn, a loose end. One persistent rumor claims she was seen in the company of high-ranking clergy shortly before her disappearance. More recently, a new theory emerged, that Orlandi knew something, that she overheard something she wasn't meant to, or saw someone in a context that would ruin reputations, a papal scandal, a hidden life, something so sensitive that a girl with a flute case had to vanish before she said a word. Over the years, bones have been unearthed in Vatican properties, once under a fountain, once beneath a tomb. Each discovery reignites the case. Each time, the Church denies a connection. But her family hasn't stopped asking, and the Vatican still hasn't given real answers. Just polite nods, sealed files, and the eerie sound of a city that knows how to keep its dead quiet. Because if someone could be erased within the Vatican itself, where faith, power, and ritual converge, then no one is safe. And maybe that's the point. Especially when you realize the Vatican might not just be watching Earth's affairs, but something else. Something moving in the heavens. Apocalyptic astronomy. Most people don't associate the Vatican with telescopes. After all, it's an ancient religious institution that still debates the timing of Easter and dresses its staff in robes from the 14th century. But high atop Mount Graham in Arizona, the Vatican quietly operates one of the most advanced observatories in the world. Its name? The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, which is a very bland name for an institution with a history of naming things after Lucifer. But the telescope's purpose isn't so bland. Officially, it's to study space, stars, galaxies, the usual. Unofficially, the theories are far more celestial. Some believe the Vatican is tracking something specific, an object, a pattern, an anomaly, something they've seen moving in the sky that doesn't belong there. A planet? A comet? A heavenly body with theological implications so devastating it's been classified as apocalyptic. One name comes up again and again: Wormwood. A star mentioned in Revelation, said to fall from the sky and poison a third of the Earth's waters. The observatory's staff denies any connection, of course. But if a massive, world-ending object was inbound, who would be more invested in its implications than the Church? Others think it's not a physical body at all, but an opening, a thinning, a veil between dimensions or realities that appears at certain alignments. And the Vatican? They're not trying to warn the public, they're trying to prepare. There are even rumors that certain popes have received astronomical briefings before making major doctrinal decisions. That deep in the archives are sky maps correlating celestial anomalies with theological events, apparitions, schisms, mass deaths, and yes, papal resignations. Why the secrecy? Because the truth isn't just scientific, it's existential. If the stars are not just stars, if they carry signatures, intentions, or prophecies, then the heavens are not passive. They are active, alive. And the Vatican is watching them like a hawk. Maybe they're tracking a return, maybe they're guarding against a sign, or maybe they already saw something that confirmed a story they've spent centuries denying. Like the legend of a pope who should never have existed. Because, according to some, there was once a woman who wore the papal crown, and she vanished from history almost as quickly as she arrived. The legend of the female pope. Pope Joan. Pope Joan. Two words that set Vatican historians clutching their rosaries like they just saw a ghost. She's the phantom pontiff of medieval scandal, the whisper, the myth, the embarrassing footnote that refuses to stay buried. The story goes like this. Sometime in the 9th century, a highly educated woman, disguised as a man, rose through the church ranks and was eventually elected pope. She reigned for a few years, intelligent, eloquent, popular, but during a public procession through Rome, she went into labor. In the middle of the street, the crowd realized the pope was a woman. And depending on which version you read, she either died on the spot, was executed, or was quietly erased. No records, no tomb, no sermons, just gone. The Vatican insists it's a myth, a Protestant slander, a folktale wrapped in anti-Catholic sentiment, and maybe an island, but the clues are bizarrely consistent. Gaps in the papal record. A centuries-long tradition of checking the Pope's gender in private before coronation. A strange avoidance of certain streets during papal processions, and even references in medieval chronicles that were later edited, redacted, or lost. Some believe the Vatican once held documents confirming Joan's existence. Letters, coins, witness accounts, all now buried beneath layers of historical denial. Others argue her story was deliberately turned into a fable to discredit the idea of female spiritual authority, make it absurd, sensational, unbelievable. But if Joan did exist, her reign represents a heresy not of doctrine, but of biology. She proves the structure isn't divine, it's institutional, that leadership isn't ordained, it's chosen. And worse, that the system can be fooled. Imagine the implications. A woman unordained, unqualified by canon law sat on the throne of Peter and the church didn't even notice. Or worse, they did and let it happen until it became politically inconvenient. Which begs the question, how much of church history is real, how much is legend, and how much has been rewritten to protect the narrative? Because once you start editing truth, there's no reason to stop. Not at a council. Not at a crossroad. Not even at the beginning, the Vatican's role in the Council of Nicaea. Let's rewind to 325 AD. A sweaty, sandal-heavy crowd of bishops gathers under Emperor Constantine's watchful gaze. The location? Nicaea. The goal? Standardize Christianity. But if you squint at the historical record hard enough, it doesn't look like a theological summit. It looks more like a hostile corporate merger, with robes instead of suits and a divine logo up for rebranding. The Council of Nicaea is often praised as the moment Christianity got its act together. Doctrine was clarified. Heresies were stomped. Jesus was declared officially divine, not just spiritually influential. But beneath the surface of that nicely polished version lies a much stranger story. One the Vatican has never been eager to fully explain. Because Nicaea wasn't just a council, it was an eraser, a shredding party, a divine re-edit. Hundreds of theological texts were dismissed or destroyed. Competing gospels, especially those that presented Jesus as a teacher of mystical knowledge instead of a sacrifice savior, were labeled heretical. Debates about the nature of Christ's divinity were resolved with political pressure, not spiritual consensus. And the bishops who disagreed? Exiled. Their writings? Lost. Their followers? Silenced. One of the most controversial moves? The selection of the canon, the books that would become the official Bible. Contrary to popular belief, the Bible didn't descend from heaven as a complete manuscript. It was cobbled together, debated, and finalized under imperial influence. Some scholars argue that the Vatican, even in its embryonic form, played a role in endorsing certain texts while rejecting others not based on truth, but on utility. There are even rumors still whispered among some theologians that pre-Nicene documents, describing a very different kind of Christianity, survive in the Vatican's sealed collections. Documents that paint a decentralized, egalitarian church. One that emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutional control. Why would the Vatican want to keep these buried? Because Nicaea wasn't just about defining truth, it was about claiming ownership, about aligning heaven's story with Rome's empire. And once you do that, unorthodox texts become threats, not footnotes. If the church rewrote its own beginnings, what else has it buried beneath the floorboards? Maybe something physical, maybe something ancient, maybe something still buried right under Vatican Hill. Buried relics beneath Vatican Hill. The Vatican has basements like an iceberg has a tip. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica lies a labyrinthine substructure of crypts, tombs, and tunnels. But the question isn't just who is buried down there, it's what. The official story gives you saints' bones, papal remains, a few questionable sarcophagi, and some very reverent marble. But rumors persist of rooms not shown on any official diagram. Sealed chambers, padlocked stone doors, and corridors so old they predate the Vatican itself. Some even whisper of trapdoors that haven't been opened in centuries, or stairs that lead to nowhere, until they don't. This isn't just Gothic atmosphere. There are real accounts from archaeologists, clergy, and once-invited outsiders that hint at something stranger beneath Vatican Hill. Relics, artifacts, objects that don't quite fit the timeline. Like what? Tablets inscribed in languages older than Latin, statuettes of winged beings with inhuman features, metallic fragments with unknown alloys. There's even speculation that the true Ark of the Covenant, yes, that Ark is locked beneath the basilica, hidden in a vault reinforced after World War II, guarded not by soldiers, but silence. Some claim the Vatican recovered relics from expeditions to the Holy Land, Egypt, even Mesopotamia, and moved them directly beneath the church's holiest ground. Items too controversial to be displayed. Items that tell a different story of biblical history. One where spiritual truths and advanced technology aren't so neatly divided. There's a persistent legend that beneath the main altar lies a sealed room, known only to the Pope and a select few, containing objects tied to pre-Christian worship, Egyptian solar discs, Babylonian relics, even fragments of what might be Sumerian machinery. Naturally, the Vatican denies all of it. There's nothing to see, they insist. Just bones and dust and tradition. But the silence itself is suspicious. Because if the church is sitting atop a stash of relics that predates the religion it's built on, then history isn't what we think it, Island, and neither is faith. And if the Vatican has indeed stored and possibly studied these ancient items, what have they learned? More importantly, what have they decided we shouldn't learn? Perhaps something that explains the very building blocks of reality. Something that smells less like incense and more like particle physics. The mystery of the Vatican's God particle records. It sounds like the setup for a sci-fi thriller. The Vatican, cloaked in ritual and robes, secretly holding records about atomic structure, energy fields, and the origins of matter centuries before modern science ever stumbled into a particle accelerator. Enter the so-called God particle theory. Not the Higgs boson itself, but the idea that the church may have known far more about quantum reality than it lets on. Ancient texts preserved in the deepest archives. Esoteric diagrams scrawled in medieval Latin. Treatises attributed to obscure theologians who wrote about the divine filament and the hidden structure of God's breath. To a theologian, those are poetic flourishes. To a physicist, those sound suspiciously like metaphors for subatomic theory. There's a persistent rumor, especially in fringe Vatican circles, that the Church possesses manuscripts describing a divine matrix underlying all of creation. Some allege these came from early Christian mystics. Others point to even older sources: Hebrew Kabbalah, Alexandrian scrolls, Babylonian star priests. And a few go all in, claiming that what the Vatican calls sacred knowledge is just quantum mechanics wrapped in divine language. But it gets stranger. Some researchers believe the Church may have once attempted to test these theories, quietly funding secret labs, recruiting rogue scientists, or exploring the intersection of matter and spirit. There are references, allegedly buried in Jesuit archives, to light harmonics, soul frequency studies, and experiments involving sound, geometry, and consciousness. So why hide it? Because if God is just math, if the universe is built on programmable particles, then faith becomes obsolete, prayer becomes code, and the divine becomes replicable. Worse still, what if the Vatican discovered something about these particles that even science hasn't? A link between matter and intention, a way to manipulate probability with belief. That would make prayer functional, dangerous, and in the wrong hands, catastrophic. Which brings us to one final piece of forbidden knowledge, a message so baffling, so potentially damning, that it was written by a nun in a language no one could understand. A letter, possibly from the devil himself.